Hello, I'm Dr. J.C. Smith, a chiropractor in Warner Robins, Georgia. And today I'm going to talk to you about more current events. The last time I spoke to you a few months ago was when the COVID crisis began, and I equated it to the spinal plague that's plaguing America and the world. You may not remember, but I showed information that there are 2,500 deaths or serious side effects per 1 million American patients from medical spine care, which is opioids, spinal injections, and spine surgeries. I mean, that epidemic continues long after COVID is gone. We're still going to have this tsunami of back surgeries and drugs that have now been totally proven ineffective for the most part. But today I want to talk to you about, today's June 12th, 2020. And right now, as you know, if you've been watching the news, Americans in the midst of what I feel is this second American Revolution. And it's caused a lot of turmoil, good and bad. Of course, they're protesting police brutality, racism, and the lack of accountability. And on a scale we haven't seen since 1968. And people out there exercising their First Amendment, unlike then 50 years ago. And I'm all for it. Of course, we don't like the looters and the rioters, but that's a small 1%. We're talking about most people out there are respectable people exercising their First Amendment to protest and petition their government. Unfortunately, we've seen the government respond in a rather brutal way. Ironically, they're brutalizing people who are protesting police brutality. But I'd like to, I'm not a politician or a social leader, even in my profession. I'm just a journalist who knows the power of the pen is mightier than the sword. You know, I'm 72 years old now, and like I said, I experienced this before in 1968 when I was a student athlete at the University of California, Berkeley, which for those of you among the more mature viewers know that was the epicenter of freedom of speech, which began in 1963, and it's been that way ever since. And also it was the center of the anti-Vietnam War protests back in the days when people protesting war were told to America, love it or leave it. Well, we know how ridiculous that is now. But back then, that was the mindset from the status quo. Nonetheless, 1968 was my first year where I experienced police brutality. It's a story I've told a lot of my friends and family members, but I was sitting in Sproul Plaza on the Berkeley campus, which is the administration buildings there, the student union, the cafeteria, and it's a big plaza where traditionally students would come and put out little folding tables like this size and distribute their brochures and information. And it's a great tradition. Every day at noon, there'd be dozens and dozens of people talking and interchanging and debating issues. Well, one day I'm sitting there eating my lunch, enjoying the beautiful Berkeley weather, and suddenly, and there was no protest going on at all, but suddenly the Alameda County Sheriff's goon squad, about 100 deputy sheriffs dressed in full riot gear, like you've seen on television lately. They come marching on the campus off Telegraph Avenue, right through Sproul Plaza, and they surrounded Wheeler Hall, which is an academic building where classes were being held. And I say nothing was happening outside of that. Suddenly, they shot tear gas into the hall. Students came running out. The cops surrounded them and took them off in mass arrest to the Alameda County Fairgrounds, where they had built temporary prisons out of chicken wire. It was like putting people in a chicken coop. No roof, no beds, no place to sit, and they had to lay on their stomach. And they could only turn their chin every 30 minutes. And if they complained, the deputy sheriffs would whack them on the bottom of their feet with a billy club. My own roommate, a track guy at Cal, he was caught up in one of those and explained the situation. But more so in another similar situation, because it wasn't just a one-time event. This went on quite often. The cops mistakenly arrested a writer for the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper. And so that Sunday, the full-page article was Alameda County Sheriff's riot, brutalized students and regular people who were just out shopping. And it was quite an eye-opener for me back then, 1968. But one deputy sheriff in particular stood out. He was the most sadistic of all, brutalizing people, terrorizing them, but everybody remembered him, not by name. They remembered him because he was the only cop that had carrot top red hair. So he stood out like a sore thumb. Nonetheless, even though these rioters, the police rioters, were definitely in the wrong, Governor Reagan, instead of reprimanding them, gave them all bonuses for standing up for law and order. That was my eye-opener to realize that not every police situation are the police the good guys. And we're seeing that now again with the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. And that's just to name the most recent. We know it. There's many, many more. So like I say, I'm all for accountability, freedom of speech, and the freedom to not be brutalized by police who lose their temper. But nonetheless, I want to make an analogy about what we see with police brutality and what I believe is medical brutality. Most people don't realize it, but when they speak of white supremacy in regular society, well, let's talk about white supremacy in healthcare called medical supremacy, because they are, after all, the guys in control of our healthcare system, which is a $3 trillion a year industry now and probably escalating as we speak. What's most interesting is that while they tell us that the American medical system is the best healthcare in the world, that is not what the facts show us at all. We're the only for-profit healthcare system in the world. That's why we're the most expensive. But other countries have, again, Medicare for all, socialized medicine, healthcare for all, whatever you want to call it, and they do much better. We'll put up a chart of the Commonwealth Health Fund, and this was a study done a few years ago of, I think, 12 countries of the world, the most industrialized countries. And as you'll see on the chart, while we did spend the most per capita, we're at the bottom of the list in most categories. Don't think we have the best health system. We don't. We may have good doctors, good emergency rooms, great surgeries, but by far and away we do way too many surgeries, we distribute too many drugs, and as I say, it's causing 2,500 per 1 million deaths or adverse effects all the time. So there are better ways. As a matter of fact, as you'll see in another chart, medical care is the third largest cause of death in the United States. It is not safe. And if it's not botched surgeries or drug overdoses, now we have super germs and medical errors and mistakes galore. I mean, as a doctor of health, let me tell you, the best thing you can do is stay away. Stay healthy, and that's what we chiropractors teach. How to get your spine aligned, and nutrition and exercise and positive attitudes, some vitamin supplements, massage therapy. There's all kinds of things that we're teaching. But nonetheless, this isn't getting out to the public, nor is the cost. There was a recent study here that I want to show you, and they found that neck and back pain was the costliest of all medical problems, to the tune of $134 billion a year. Other musculoskeletal problems that we help, such as knees, joints, elbows, carpal tunnel, TMJ, they amounted to $129 million. So all total for these musculoskeletal disorders was $264 billion. Diabetes, which was the next highest, was only at $111 billion. Heart disease was $89 billion, dementia was $79, among others. So, like I say, we're not talking about a little problem. We're talking about a problem that plagues the United States and the world. For example, back pain is the #1 disabling condition in America, the workplace, the military, and globally. And there has been recent studies to address this problem, and they all come to the same conclusion. Stop with drug shots and surgeries. Those are for only the red flags, which is less than 10%. 90% of people's musculoskeletal problems, are like you and me, are due to biomechanical structural problems that we chiropractors help best with our non-drug, non-surgical, as they call conservative treatments. Actually, there's a lot of critical reporting coming out now. I especially like one entitled Surgeons Gone Wild. And they really have. We see it here in our little town. There's a surgeon in Centerville that is out of control. I've had 3 of his victims come to see me who never needed surgery in the first place. They just had stiff necks. And for those of us who are anatomically aware of the spine, that means the top 2 vertebrae, the atlas axis, are misaligned and you just can't turn your head. That requires no surgery, it requires a good adjustment and follow-up spinal flexibility exercises. But this con artist convinced these people to have their whole neck a laminectomy, where they take the back half of the vertebra off, and then he put rods and fused the whole damn thing. Huh? Talk about an overkill? And he charged them $250,000. And I've seen 3 of those people come to my little office. I only can imagine across the nation how these unnecessary, barbaric, expensive, and unnecessary surgeries are occurring. Even Dartmouth said 40 to 50% of all heart, back, hip, and knee surgeries are unnecessary. But what we're finding is that doctors don't follow guidelines, they don't follow criticism, they follow the money. And no one's policing them. Just like with bad cops, they're not accountable. This doctor I mentioned, he's never been brought up in front of the board. Unless they start killing people, then yeah, maybe afterwards, just like when black people are killed, maybe months or years later, the doctor is accountable, like we've seen some places. But overall, doctors have gone wild. They're the ones who created the opioid crisis, which, you know, is the active ingredient in opioids, like, you know, hydrocodone and tramadol and those things, is medicinal heroin. And we wonder why people get addicted, why it's being abused. Spinal injections are worthless. As one researcher, Roger Chow, said, they're underwhelming. And they're charging, I've heard of one guy who paid $4,000 for one shot in the neck that did nothing. And back surgeries, the average is $80,000 according to the Mayo Clinic. So you see there's a big need for reform. But right now, this is not being addressed. And why is that? Well, that's what I've been talking about in my books, like The Medical War Against Chiropractors, is that there really is a war by the medical profession against all complementary and alternative medical providers, not just chiropractors, although we're the biggest enemy since we're the biggest opponent. But they already killed off true osteopaths, homeopaths, naturopaths. They went after optometrists. They've gone after dentists. Now they're going after nurses. Anybody who competes with them, they will attack unmercifully. They will politically do dirty tricks. They'll marginalize you in healthcare policies where you get excluded, and, you know, redlining, if you will. And it's amazing what's going on, but it's going on because they're in control. And until we have riots demanding differently, they will stay in control. Because, as you may remember before, the medical lobby is the biggest lobbyist in this country. It's 3 times bigger than the military-industrial complex. They own every congressman. They own the president. They own everything. It's not just a medical profession, but it's the hospitals who profit greatly by back surgeries, device manufacturers, imaging centers, and of course, big pharma. They all are together in cahoots to deny you the right to see a chiropractor. Like I say, it's the biggest disability in the world now, and it's built on widespread misconceptions that we talked about in the past. But it's also built on what I call chirophobia, where the medical, that's what my second book is about, To Kill a Chiropractor, the media war against chiropractors. The AMA in the 1930s began this incredible propaganda campaign against chiropractors. It was as strong as the Nazi propaganda campaign against Jews and Gypsies. And it was just as intent. Their goal was to contain and eliminate the chiropractic profession. People don't realize it, but chirophobia, as I call it, the prejudice against chiropractors, it goes back to 120 years. This is not a new phenomenon. And in the first half of the 20th century, 12,000 chiropractors were arrested over 15,000 times. And that only stopped when every state passed a scope of license bill that enabled us to practice without being harassed by the medical field. But they made mass arrests just like they're doing now. And I detail all that. We'll show pictures of chiropractors being arrested. And also there's pictures of their patients who are outside the jail picketing to have their doctors released. And it's not that long ago, but the last chiropractor in the United States arrested in Shreveport, Louisiana, was in 1975. His name was Dr. E.J. Nasser. I spoke to him one day before he passed away, and I really take my hat off to those early chiropractors. They had courage unlike we probably see today, and they were willing to go to work knowing they could be arrested any time. When I wrote my book, a man who practices in New York phoned and told me about his father, who was a chiropractor back in the 30s and 40s, and that the juice man would come around every so often demanding money, extorting him. And if father couldn't come up with the money, they would literally take his father out in the front yard and beat him up as a warning. And I'm not exaggerating. This is the kind of brutality that the medical profession has resorted to. And so like I say, there is medical supremacy and brutality that is going on to this day. And the fact that you're not even given a freedom of choice in who can treat you. For example, I applied for hospital privileges back after the Wilk trial ended in the early 90s, and I was abruptly told by the board that they didn't want a chiropractor on staff. Why? Because we would take money out of their pockets. Again, you have no freedom of choice when you go in the medical system, whether it's a hospital or even medical health insurance. For example, on base, Robins Air Force Base, TRICARE covers chiropractic, but not there. I've written about that on my website, Chiropractors for Fair Journalism. I have an article there that you can read. Same with workman's comp on base. Federal workman's comp, we're a legal benefit, but I've never had a patient. And when I complained to them, they turned a deaf ear. And then finally, recently, I got a response that was actually truthful. They said that you can only see a chiropractor on federal workman's comp if you can detect a vertebral subluxation on x-ray. Great, I'm all for that. Medicare has the same kind of rule. Unfortunately, the colonel out there who sent me that information, he said they did a study from 2013 to 2018 in which there's about 8,000, 10,000 injured workers out there. It's a big base, it's got 20,000 employees, and they do a lot of hard work on those planes. And yet not one was referred to any chiropractor. And I asked why. He says, because the radiologist never detected a vertebral subluxation. Isn't that amazing, considering that vertebral subluxations or spinal misalignments, according to research, is the cause of 50 to 90% of all back problems. Depends on who's doing the research. But for them to tell me there was not one in a 5-year span, this is the boycott. This is medical prejudice, controlling the system, and segregating chiropractors out of it. So like I say, that brutality is not only against me or any chiropractor by denying us access to the free market, but it's denying patients out there. And this is one reason they just refer everyone in for back surgeries. Macon is the back surgery capital of the state of Georgia because of that, and it's 4th on the list nationally. This is brutality, when people cannot come in here for a safer, more effective, non-drug solution, but instead are forced onto opioids, injections, and surgery. This is nuts, and it's also expensive. I think every taxpayer should be asking their politicians, why are we wasting money on back shots and surgeries when you can go to a chiropractor? Actually, there are ethical surgeons in the medical world. I read their reports, and the Backletter Journal, Mr. Mark Shoney said, quote, the poster child that back surgeries and spine care was the poster child of inefficient care that has become a national scandal. And it is, especially if you're the victim. We see people here all the time with failed back surgery. What can I tell them? You've been misdiagnosed and ripped off by your MD. And they have. We adjust them, and in most cases they get better, because most back pain is joint dysfunction. Again, the vertebral subluxation is the big term. It's where the joints of the spine are jammed, twisted, and misaligned, or buckled and compressed. We adjust those, decompress them, and people get better. And then they get mad. They say, why didn't you tell me to go to chiropractor first? I said, that's a good question. People are being denied their rights. They're being brutalized by a medical profession where it's all about money. But another ethical spine leader, Dr. Alf Nicholson, a Swedish doctor, surgeon, he was the founder editor of the Spine Journal and the leading spokesman for the spine surgery. But he's called for a moratorium because they know these doctors are out of control, way too many drug shots and surgeries. And even the Australian Medical Journal called for a moratorium of spine surgeries. And they suggested, unless it's a red flag, cancer, fractures, infections, but for those of us with just chronic, acute back problems due to biomechanical structural misalignment, they said in a year's time doing conservative care, 90% of those people will be well. But do you think that's going to go over well in the United States? I don't think so. That's why I say there's no accountability in medicine. And anyway, The problem is that just like we have civil rights laws and such, discrimination still occurs. Like I say, we're segregated in the military health service. We still have media defamation. Let me ask you one simple question. When was the last time you've seen a fair and balanced article about the benefits chiropractors bring to an ailing world where, again, back pain is the #1 disabling condition? You haven't, have you? And you never will. And as I explained in my book, it's because who controls the medical media? Again, all our medical doctor announcers and big pharma drug companies pay for them. And they don't want a non-drug solution on their dime telling the public, by the way, you might see a chiropractor. For example, Sanjay Gupta is the medical correspondent at CNN. In my book, I have a whole chapter dedicated to him. I first contacted him in 2007 when he was putting out this information that chiropractors are causing strokes. I'd never heard of that. Subsequently, I have, because that stuff went viral. But when it first came out, I actually phoned my malpractice company and I said, is this true? And the officers there said, we don't know. We've never had a claim for that. That's how rare it is. And again, turns out that the rarity is one accident in 5.85 million instances. 1 in 6 million. That's how rare it is. So I sent a letter to Dr. Gupta saying, why don't you balance that with talking about how your profession is causing 2,500 accidents per 1 million? Never heard back. Well, then again, I had another run-in with him to point out his chirophobia and also how he's withholding information to the public, to the American consumers. Because I speak in my book and these videos about Dr. Scott Bowden, MD. He's an orthopedic surgeon of great renown. He's actually now the director up at Emory Spine Center. Good guy. I mentioned in my books, he's done great work, but his claim to fame in 1990 was when he did research, MRI studies on people with and without back pain. Yet he found bad discs in both groups. And that's the whole thing. If you've got a bad back, they say, oh, you got a bad disc, you need surgery. Yet it stumped him. He says, well, we're finding bad discs in people with no pain. I can show you thousands of people like that. Conversely, I can show you thousands of people who have back surgery, adjust, and they get better, but they still have all that garbage in it, the bone spurs, the bad discs. Because again, most back pain is joint dysfunction. So I wrote to Dr. Gupta again saying, why have you never told your viewing audience that just because you have a bad disc doesn't mean you need surgery? As Dr. Bowden showed. And since then, there's been 32 other studies, and now the Mayo Clinic's saying the same thing. For example, by the time you're 50 years old, there's an 80% chance you're going to have a bad disc of some sort, but you have no pain. Again, these are asymptomatic patients who are showing arthritis and disc compression and stuff like that. So I asked Dr. Gupta, I said, why aren't you telling the public that? Because they work at the same place in Emory University. Dr. Sanjay Gupta and Dr. Scott Bowden, they work on the same place, in the same kind of conditions. Again, I hear nothing back. And then when my book came out, my publicist contacted Sanjay Gupta, hoping to do an interview. And that's when he was told that I'd been banned at CNN for telling the truth, asking him to tell the truth. So I say, you're not going to hear this kind of information. I recommend you watch my other videos before you certainly make any decision to have back surgery or you or your family. But actually, the research now is all in our favor. For example, Dr. Anthony Rosner, PhD, testified before the Institute of Medicine. He said, quote, today we can argue that chiropractic care, at least for back pain, appears to have vaulted from last to first place as a treatment option. Hello, how come you've not heard that on the news? Another interesting statistic that has been ignored for years, because this came out in the 1990s. Dr. David Eisenberg, up at Harvard, the Osher Institute, stunned the medical world when he found that more Americans were seeking non-drug, non-surgical solutions, the CAM, complementary and alternative medicine solutions, made more visits to them. More baby boomers, they made 427 million office visits to non-MDs in 1990 compared to 388 million visits to MDs. A follow-up survey in 1997 found that the numbers to non-MDs rose to 629 million, while the numbers to MDs went down 386 million. Yes, you see the trend. These two stories stunned the medical world. They were bewildered, and I read this and heard this on the news. They said, why are Americans choosing alternative quacks over modern medicine? That's what they're telling the public. Again, they won't give credence, and maybe what we're doing works better than what they're doing, especially for back problems. It was interesting, Dr. Eisenberg, who I heard lecture once, he's a fair-minded guy, he noted his own view of chiropractic has changed from his early days to the present. He was taught in med school that chiropractic was irrelevant, worthless, a waste of money, and dangerous. In the 1980s, it changed to unproven, unorthodox, and unconventional. But yet after all these studies started coming out in the 90s, then suddenly he noted the terminology was changed from complementary and alternative now to integrative and comprehensive. So you can see things are changing within ethical medical world. You're not going to hear this from your local spine surgeon or medical doctor because they got that Jim Crow MD attitude. They have this supremacist attitude that drugs, shots, and surgery is the best and everything else is bad, even though the statistics prove otherwise. This is why you cannot believe what your doctor is telling you. Take it with a grain of salt is my attitude. And actually, I say Dr. Eisenberg, he's an honest man. He concluded maybe alternative isn't so alternative anymore. Again, none of that got any press attention. Imagine if Dr. Eisenberg from Harvard was on the news telling this stuff. It might change a few ideas. Same with, what if Dr. Gupta suddenly had a streak of honesty and told you the same? You say, well, that carries some weight. Maybe people would start changing their attitudes to understand that chirophobia was just a propaganda campaign to invalidate our expertise. Even though, as Dr. Rosner says, now we've gone from the bottom to the top of the heap. Unfortunately, Americans aren't being told that. One last thing I'd like to talk about is what would I do if I were in charge of Health and Human Services, in charge of the government. Well, I'd like to remind people that what America needs first and foremost is the freedom of choice in healthcare, just like we have religious freedom. And this is not a new idea. This goes back to the days of our founding fathers. And Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a founding father and signer of the Declaration of Independence, warned of the rise of a medical monopoly. I mentioned this in my medical war book. He was actually allegedly George Washington's personal doctor. But he believed in the separation of powers as it applies to the exercise of the professions too. And here's what he said. The Constitution of this republic should make specific provision for medical freedom as well as for religious freedom. To restrict the practice of the art of healing to one class of physicians and deny to other equal privileges constitutes the Bastille of our science. All such laws are un-American and despotic. They are vestiges of monarchy and have no place in a republic. But that is exactly what we have today, a medical monopoly. He also talked about the exclusion of other healthcare practitioners, conferring exclusive privileges upon bodies of physicians and forbidding men of equal talents and knowledge from practicing medicine with certain districts of cities and countries are inquisitions, however sanctioned by ancient charters and names, serving as the Bastille of our profession. I love this guy. Of course, it all fell on deaf ears because it didn't include medical freedom in the Bill of Rights. He foresaw the day that has now happened, the formation of a medical undercover dictatorship. Let me read this to you. Here's what he said. Unless we put medical freedoms into the Constitution, the time will come when medicine will organize into an undercover dictatorship. Dr. Rush foresaw the future when he described this undercover dictatorship in medicine. And but in our regard, it's not undercover. They're blatant about it. They're on top of the heap and they're going to stay there, and no one's going to get them off. They own Congress, with being the biggest lobbyist. They are institutionalized because all of the bureaucrats and insurance companies and government health are all MDs. No, they've got a firm hold on this. So, what can you do? Well, I would suggest you start asking your insurance companies why they're not covering chiropractic. And they have no good reason because all the research is on our side. But still, that medical prejudice, chirophobia, is so ingrained. It's like asking Donald Trump, why are you so against freedom of choice in black people? And he can say, oh, I'm not. And in fact, the whole history shows that he is, just like with these medical doctors. And they're quite proud of it. It's like the Nazis were quite proud of eliminating the Jews and the Gypsies. You're not going to change their attitude overnight. But it was interesting, speaking of Donald Trump, one of the best papers I've ever read was published in 2018 by his administration. It was called Reforming America's Healthcare System Through Choice and Competition. You can go to the HHS website and read this. In my writings on my website, Chiropractors for Fair Journalism, I have an article about it if you'd like to go there. But it was written by cabinet members Alex Azar, Secretary of Department of HHS, Stephen Mnuchin, Secretary of U.S. Department of Treasury, and Alexander Acosta, Secretary of U.S. Department of Labor. It's fascinating. Their summation was spot on concerning issues we chiropractors can certainly attest to, such as the barriers to market competition. Again, there's no freedom of choice and there's no free enterprise in healthcare. But here's the quote: "We know the United States healthcare system too often fails to deliver the value it should. This report identifies barriers on the federal and state levels to market competition that stifle innovation, lead to higher prices, and do not incentivize improvements in quality. It recommends policies that will foster a healthcare system that delivers high-quality care at affordable prices through greater choice, competition, and consumer-directed healthcare spending." I love it. I just wish that were implemented in our systems, and they're not. Because again, the status quo is what controls the system. And even President Obama, at his 2013 inaugural speech, he said similarly, "Together we can discover that a free market only thrives when there are rules to ensure competition and fair play." And we don't see that in healthcare. And like I say, healthcare control is DOA on Capitol Hill. The Trump report also spoke of the resistance to reform by the entrenched medical status quo. Listen to this. "While American consumers and many providers would significantly benefit from the reforms laid out in this report, there are entrenched and powerful special interest groups that reap large profits from the status quo. It will take bold leadership to confront these incumbents and implement reforms." Again, that's the American medical establishment, the biggest lobby on Capitol Hill. They're not going to let go of this $3 trillion industry, and it's probably higher than that. Now, the Trump report summarized this situation well. In particular, this report aims to address these issues as crystallized in the following problem statement. Many government laws, regulation, guidance, requirements, and policies at both the federal and state level have reduced incentives for price and non-price competition, increased barriers to entry, promoted and allowed excessive consolidation, and resulted in healthcare markets that lack the benefits of vigorous competition. Increasing competition and innovation in the healthcare sector will reduce costs and increase quality of care, improving the lives of all Americans. I take my hat off to the Trump administration for this report. But guess what? Did you ever hear it in the media? No. Isn't that amazing? Probably the best thing I think Trump's ever done has been ignored by the media. It's absolutely amazing, the power, because the medical media is not going to allow this kind of attitude to be aired on their dime. It's sad. So anyway, indeed, the unreasonable and illegal restraint of trade against chiropractors remains a problem for injured patients and a huge expense for taxpayers and business owners who foot the bill when patients are railroaded to expensive, ineffective medical spine care. So, again, as healthcare costs continue to rise and bankrupt more people, please keep in mind my suggestion today, and most importantly, go see your local chiropractor. Learn how to be well naturally. Otherwise, I hope you learned something. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.